Okay, so today is June 10th, 2021. My name is Maria Saldana, and I am here with Mel Saenz. Thank you for being here. Can you start by telling me when and where you were born?
I was born in Jersey City, New Jersey, in the United States.
And then when were you born?
I was born January 26th of 1996.
That's Aquarius, right?
Yep.
For sure. My abuelita is the day before you.
So.
Okay, so you were born in Jersey City. Did you grow up in Jersey City?
No, I actually grew up in Union City, New Jersey, which is a couple towns away. And I grew up till I was 20 actually. And then I moved to West New York, New Jersey, which is literally a town over.
Okay. And so Union City, and then where are you currently?
West New York, New Jersey. Okay. A lot of people think it's New York, but it's actually a part of New Jersey. It's literally just in front of New York.
Okay. So you grew up there. And where is your family from?
So my biological father is from Peru. He is from Paramonga. And my mom is Cuban, from La Habana.
Okay. So your father is from Peru. You said Paramonga?
Paramonga. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And where is that, like geographically in Peru? Do you know?
Like 30 minutes from Barranca, if you're aware of Barranca.
Okay. Okay, yes. Perfect. Okay. And so would you share a little bit about your relationship to your Peruvian identity?
Yeah, so when I grew up, even though my biological father and I really don't have a good relationship, I still hold strongly my Peruvian upbringing. I love the food. I was introduced to the culture as a child. So it grew very heavy on me, but 2019, after I graduated undergrad, I actually spent 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks in Peru. And that's when I fell in love with Peru, and I got to meet my family, and I got to meet the traditions. And it was just a really beautiful experience, which I've always wanted ever since I was a child. But due to like my relationship with my father, I didn't have the opportunity. So when I became of age, I decided to leave and go to Peru, and I saw Machu Picchu. I saw La Montañas de Siete Colores, like everything. And I really enjoyed it. And I hold strongly in my Peruvian culture, because it's one of the cultures that I grew up with. I have family here, and I do talk to them. I talk to my nieces and everything, and they speak Quechua. And so, like, for me, it's just like bringing tradition back to myself, and actually like knowing who I am. Although it took forever, it's nice to know now like what's a part of me, and Peru is like most definitely a part of me. I hold everything. When people ask me what country I'm from, I always say Peru first before Cuba. And then when people mention food, I was like, Peruvian food is the best food. I was like, we have one for the past 8 years. And so I love Peru, like the culture, the food, the people, everything.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that with me. So you said that you got to go back. Well, you got to go to Peru. Was that your first time going to Peru in 2019?
Yeah.
Okay. What was that experience like for you? You touched a little bit about meeting your family, seeing the different places.
So it was nice. It was a culture shock at the beginning, because I was raised in the United States, and I do speak Spanish. thankfully to my stepfather, which I consider my father, he taught me Spanish. He's from Guatemala. So ever since I was small, he always had a strong belief of me learning Spanish. So going back to Peru, it was a culture shock, first of all. As soon as I went to Peru, I saw my cousin. I was like, oh my God, you're short like me. I was like, hey, girl. And she's like, I don't know English. I was like, okay, let me talk Spanish. And I met my aunt, who looks very similar to my dad. And it was just really nice. They're very like heartwarming. Like literally, as soon as I went to the apartment, my aunt was like, did you eat? You gotta unpack. You gotta sleep. There's a bed. You must be tired. And I was like, no, Tia, like I'm good. And it was really nice to get to see my family. I met cousins that I never even met. I met like whole generations. Like I met like grandchildren. I met like my cousins, my uncles, my aunts. It was just really beautiful because it's something I've always wanted. And like I would see them in pictures and they would see me in pictures and we add each other through Facebook. But it's not the same thing as going to Peru and learning about my own culture. I even found out I have an aunt that I never even knew of. And she lives in the northern part. And it was really nice because she only speaks Quechua. I mean, she speaks Spanish too. But where she lives is they predominantly only speak Quechua. And the whole time I was in the taxi, I was like, I don't know Quechua. And my aunt was like, oh my God, you're so American. And I was like, am I? And then it hit me. I was like, oh yeah, I'm American. And they had guinea pigs and everything. And I'm vegan. So my aunt was like, do you want me to kill an animal? I was like, no. I was like, don't. I was like, I'm vegan. Please don't kill an animal. She's like, okay. And then I went to church and they spoke Spanish and Quechua. So it's a beautiful thing. And it's something I've always wanted to do ever since I was a child. I'm like, oh, to look at Peru and I would see pictures. I'm like, one day I'll be in Peru. So the fact that I even have pictures in my room and everything about Machu Picchu is just like a blessing. That I was very fortunate enough to go to my actual country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you touched a little bit upon what it was like to meet your family for the first time, right? And then you mentioned that it was culture shock, but it also sounds like it was an experience that it sounds like it like affirmed your Peruvian identity. Is that correct?
Yes, it did. A lot, actually. Like I now could talk to Peruvians like, oh yeah, I'm from this place, and like I've been to this place. Back then I was like, I'm from Lima, and they're like, oh well, por Paramonga, and they're like, have you been? And I'm like, no. They're like, so you're American, you're not Peruvian, and I'm like, no, I'm Peruvian. So now actually, going to Paramonga and my aunt lived in Barranca, so I stayed majority of the time with her. Now I could tell people, yeah, I went to the beach in Barranca. I know these restaurants in Paramonga. And so now I could actually talk to Peruvians and have a decent conversation instead of like, oh yeah, you know, my father's from Peru. And they're like, oh, that's great. Do you know anything about Peru? And I would be like, no, I just know my dad from Paramonga. And now I could be like, no, he was all the details and everything.
Yeah, it's a different experience, right? Like to actually put faces to people, right? To family, or to actually experience. I think you said that you spent like 2-3 weeks there, but to actually like experience, you know, a little bit of what life is like in Peru, I think it adds something else to the experience. And you also said that you know you touched on the fact that they would tell you that you're American, right? And I'm wondering like what that brought up for you when you were in Peru when you would hear those comments.
I mean, at the beginning, it would kind of hurt me because at the end of the day, like I am Peruvian and I'm also Cuban. However, yes, I was born in the United States. Yes, You know, the customs here that we have in the United States are different from Peru. So at first I was like a little upset. I'm like, yeah, but I'm Peruvian. Like, clearly your brother is my dad. And after a while, I'm like, now I know. Like, after seeing how they talk and everything, I'm like, yeah, I'm American. And like, there's nothing like my aunt has a chakra and she had donkeys and pigs and everything. And I'm like naming them. I'm like, don't kill them. I love the animals. And she's like, this is a profit. We kill guinea pigs for a profit. And I was like, oh my God, why would you do such a thing? And she's like, mija, tú eres más americana que nada. I was like, oh, I am. And then it brought up a lot of things. It's like, yes, I was born in the United States, but now going to Peru, I'm like, oh, you know, now I'm Peruvian. And so at first it hurt, but I understand why they're coming from, because like my aunt had a shower outside near the animals. I was like, I'm not going to take a shower near the animals. I was like, you have to bring me to my other aunt in the city. I was like, I need a hot shower. I need a bathroom, like a running bathroom. I'm not peeing in like one of those like toilets without running water. I was like, no, ma'am. I was like, I need heat. And they have like tambos where you wash your face. And I was like, tia, you know, I go. So I was like, bring me back to my tia Usala. I was like, I'm going to that house. And at one point I was texting my cousin via Facebook because I didn't want to insult my aunt. And I was like, we need to go. I can't sleep here. I was like, I'm not taking a shower with the animals. I was like, absolutely not. I was like, we need to go. And my aunt was like, she's American. Clearly. She doesn't live the life I do. And I felt bad. In reality, I felt like I was insulting her. I was insulting my culture. But it's something I'm not adjusted to. And now actually going to her house and going to her chakra, like I noticed the difference. And I noticed like I was more appreciative of the food and, you know, what she grew in her chakra and like the animals and everything. And it taught me to be humble of everything I have in the United States. You know, they don't have a running shower. My other aunt does, you know, and even within Peru, there's so many, like my aunt's higher class, she has her own house and my other aunt doesn't. She has like a little cave where she sleeps with my uncle and my cousin. And so just seeing the difference just made me feel so humble. Now that I go to other countries, like I use their bathroom, like I don't question. I'm like, do I pay you? Like what's going on? And I usually tip them. And when I go to other countries, like it taught me to be more like humble and more appreciative of the hard work that people do in these countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what a difference of life experiences, right? Mm-hmm. I think that you know, like even just speaking for myself, whenever I go back to Iquitos, it's my home, it's my family's home, and it's still an adjustment, right? Like that's not the lifestyle that they live in Iquitos, or at least my family lives. And you were even naming, you know, the lifestyle that your families live. You can even see differences when you're in Peru, right? With how, like, you know, the different lives that your tias live, and then what that looks like for you in the States. So thank you for sharing all of that. How do you maintain your relationship with Peru or with your Peruvian identity?
So how do I keep? That's a good question. Well, you know, I keep learning more things about Peru. I'm learning a million when it comes to politics and everything that's going on. I educate myself because these are things that like I was never taught, because I don't have a good relationship with my father. So now it's like every day I look at Peruvian news and I follow Peruvian like Instagram accounts, and I'm learning more about the Peruvian culture. Like I follow, and every day when people ask me and they're like, oh, like what's going on in Peru, I could finally say, these are the things that are happening in Peru, and that's why people are protesting it. And now, since I have a good relationship with some of my cousins in Peru, I'm like, oh my God, are you okay? Like, do you need money? What's going on with the protest and everything from there? So that's how I keep my identity strong. And not only that, but like, obviously, like, even though I'm vegan, I do a lot of Peruvian vegan meals like lomo sotao, ceviche, papa a la huancaína. So I try to keep the tradition and myself every day and remind myself that I am Peruvian. So that's like basically how I maintain myself and claim to be Peruvian.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And, you know, I think that the ways that we maintain our relationship to Peru, or like even our own Peruvian identity, like look very differently for each of us. And so I'm grateful that you shared, you know, the ways that you do that for yourself. And so how has the experience of living in the diaspora affected your Peruvian identity? You touched a little bit on it when you were seeing, you know, you got to Peru, you had culture shock, but I'm wondering if anything else comes up for you when you think about that.
Besides the culture shock, like, unfortunately in Peru, there's a lot of domestic abuse within relationships, and it's something that I heard Peru has like a lot of domestic abuse, but I didn't think it was true. A lot of people are, like, usually make up lies about every country, and so when I went to Peru, I thought it was a lie, and so I started seeing a lot of domestic abuse in my in my aunt's house, and there's a lot of trauma that has happened because of domestic abuse. Also, being LGBTQ is not a thing in Peru. So I basically had to hide my sexual identity. My aunt still thinks I have a boyfriend in America who's Colombian, because I had to make up a lie. And so it was different. And just seeing all the differences was shocking. The fact that I have tattoos everywhere and I had a nose piercing, and when I went to Peru in my aunt's house, knowing she's straight to the core to the Bible, I had to hide all my tattoos because I'm like, oh my God, what if she judges me? The last day she got me mad. I was like, you know what? I was like, see all my tattoos, you're gonna deal with it. And she's like, you're so crazy. And I was like, okay. But it was difficult because like every once in a while she's like, so how's your boyfriend? And I'm like, my boyfriend's good. I'm like, he's living, he's there striving. And then my cousins were like, are you with somebody? Like, and I was like, my cousins know that I am queer. So my cousin was like, are you with a friend? Like a friend, or are you with a friend? And I was like, no, I'm with nobody. I was like, you could tell me, like, we all know you're gay now, except for my mom. I'm like, do not tell your mom. I was like, God forbid you tell my aunt, she would die. And so religion also plays a huge role in Peru, and I wasn't used to it. So every day my aunt would try to like keep me in church. She's like, let's go to church. And I'm like, no, tia. I was like, yo tengo mucho sueño. I was like, I'm gonna go to sleep. I would just be on my phone and like acting asleep. So every time she would knock on the door, I would act asleep so I wouldn't go to church. So it's just funny recalling all the memories I had in Peru.
Yeah, and I imagine that you know, when you recall those, like they're gonna be different from what you experience, you know, in Jersey, right? Like you're in Jersey. And you also touched on you know, the like queerness. And so I'm gathering these narratives from queer Peruvians in the diaspora, you know, because I know that in doing my master's work and just, like personally, like going on social media and all of these things, I was seeing, like, I wasn't seeing us. I wasn't seeing queer Peruvians, especially like outside. I wasn't really seeing them as much in Peru, but also I was like, oh, for me, identifying as queer Peruvian was really central to how I navigated the world. And so I think that I would have liked to have seen other folks that at least identify similarly, right? And so I think that's a piece of why I'm also doing this project. And so in talking about your queer identity, what can you talk to me a little bit more about that? Can you expand on your queer identity?
Yeah, so I came out 2015 being bisexual. And so it was difficult for me. My mom and my stepfather weren't the biggest fans. Neither was my biological father. In fact, my stepmom actually outed me out when a couple years later, 2018, I came out as a lesbian. But I was like physically posting stuff in Facebook and everything. And I thought I blocked my stepmother, and I didn't. And so she told my dad when we were eating dinner as a family, and she's like, your daughter's gay. And my dad was like, listen, I don't care if you're gay or anything, but don't post it online because my family follows you. And in my head, I was like, why is that such a big deal? That's who I am, and I'm not going to hide myself for like people's pleasure. I mean, I understand why he said that because, again, the religion is really important in Peru. But now that my cousins know, like even my cousin a couple of days ago, she posted something for Pride Month in Spanish, and she's like, oh, to all my LGBTQ members in Peru, like, I love you and this and that. So, being like coming out as bisexual in general was hard, and it's only harder when you come out as a lesbian. And really in Hispanic communities, because there's a lot of machismo happening. And so they automatically assume like one person has to be the male in the relationship when it's two females, and I never understood that. So it's been difficult. It took a couple of years now. My parents are so like welcoming to a majority of my partners. Like currently I have a partner who was my best friend before we even dated, and my parents love her. I don't bring my girlfriend around my biological father or his family. The last time I did bring an ex-girlfriend around, I was with her for 3 years, and my stepmother was like, oh, I really want to meet your girlfriend. And the day I did, they made very homophobic comments. My brother-in-law did, and an uncle did, and I just didn't feel comfortable. And so from that day on, I have not brought any of my partners. I refrain from showing my Peruvian side. Well, I refrain from everybody in general, but I just don't want to go through that experience again. It was very belittling. I felt like very excluded. I mean, I feel excluded from my father's side, from my half-sisters and my stepmother. My father actually cheated on my stepmother with my mother, and they had me. And so ever since then, they're not the biggest fan of me because I was a child out of wedlock and I destroyed a marriage. Even though they're still together, my stepmother isn't really the biggest fan of me, which I understand why, and I understand she has her reasons. But that day, I don't ever want to put myself ever in that aspect. I don't ever want to be belittled. I don't ever want to feel like I'm a nuisance or basically a piece of crap because of my sexuality, because at the end of the day, we're all human, and whoever I love, you know, is behind closed doors. I'm not openly holding my girlfriend's hands in front of them or anything. Like, I respect boundaries. But the fact of the matter is that they made me feel like crap. And it got to the point that my half sister had to come and tell my brother-in-law, hey, you know, don't say things like that because it could hurt her. And luckily for me at that time, my ex-girlfriend didn't know Spanish, but God forbid she did. She would have been insulted and she would have gotten away. I lasted 10 minutes in that party. I said hi to everyone and sat down, drank a beer, and we left. I was like, never again. And ever since then, I haven't brought any of my partners. My dad always brings up like, hey, are you dating anybody? And they try to see my Facebook and like search around. And I don't post anything. And if I do, I usually block all of them. Because again, I don't want to be like treated like crap for who I love. And so since then, like, I'm very refrained. I'm an open book to everybody. If somebody asks me, oh, are you dating somebody? Yeah, my girlfriend. Oh, are you gay? I was like, no. I was like, you know, I'm queer. I was like, I prefer women. However, like I'm open for a trans woman, and it creates a dialect. But everybody knows, like, I have a girlfriend. I'm very open. People ask me all the time, how is it being queer? And I'm like, you know, like, it's difficult. Some people are not going to approve of you or your sexuality or your relationship. But at the end of the day, you know, you have to be your true self, because if you're not, nobody's going to respect you. And so sexuality for me, it's like a really big deal, because it is a part of me, of who I am.
Yeah, thank you, one, for sharing all of that. And, you know, I'm sitting with everything that you have shared, because you mentioned quite a bit in you know, answering this question. And something that's coming up for me is, you know, you said that, you know, you were hearing negative comments said about you and your partner, you know, around family, or like that was coming from family. And so, you know, I think that there can be very real harm that comes from people close to us. And also, you know, you're saying that you are making a choice. It sounds like you're making a choice in who you share that part of yourself with. And I think that it speaks to like larger things about like self-preservation, right? So like, who deserves to know who I'm dating, or who deserves to know this part of me, right? Or who deserves to have access to me in that way. And also, you know, earlier you named this notion of coming out, right? Coming out as bisexual, then coming out as lesbian, using the term queer. And I think it makes me think of the fact that, you know, queerness isn't always linear, right? So it can, you know, as we go about our journey in queerness or in ourselves, right? Like thinking about our identities, they can shift. And it's still valid, right? I think sometimes that people think that queer folks, when they come out, that's it. But even in you saying, right, like, who am I going to share this with in my family? I think coming out is not a one-time thing, right? So you're constantly having to see and choose who you want to come out to. And again, our identities shift. So thank you for naming all of that. And so what does queerness mean to you in general?
Basically, like, I hate to refrain, because even the definition, lesbian is a woman dating a woman. And so I hate that it's so like a square, like there's no like ins or out. And then people always ask me, are you open to dating trans women? I'm like, of course, like they're women. Like what makes you think I'm not gonna date a trans woman? So like, are you able to date a bisexual woman? I was like, again, they're a woman. Like, and then some people are like, are you open to dating gender non-conforming? I was like, of course. And so queer for me is just like loving who I am, but also loving the person who I'm dating with, but also being open instead of just women dating women. I'm more open to say queer. So when people question me, it's like, hey, I'm queer. They're like, oh, so you're more open to dating trans women and gender non-conforming. Because usually when I say lesbian, they're like, oh, you would never date a trans woman. And I'm like, but they're women. And so queer for me is basically more open, like a more open terminology instead of saying lesbian. However, sometimes when people ask me, I usually say I'm dating my partner who is a female. They're like, oh, are you a lesbian? I was like, yes, but I also identify as queer. And they'll ask me questions and I educate them. And they're like, so why don't you just say lesbian? I was like, because lesbian excludes the trans community, but also gender non-conforming. And they're like, oh, so queer or lesbian? I was like, just call me queer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like, you know, as you're speaking, it sounds like queer gives you more room, right? More room to love who it is that you want to love, right? And I hear you on limits of some definitions, I think, of labels, right? Even, you know, I identify as bisexual, and I get questions a lot about, you know, can you date trans folks? Can you date? And I'm like, of course, right? Like what? Like I'm bisexual, and so I think that you're also speaking to larger notions of what each of these terms mean. And in that, right, like even thinking about queer community, the like definitions, like the meanings behind labels are going to vary. And so I'm curious what queer community means for you.
Well, queer community means family. It means that I could be myself. It means being celebrated for who I am, being loved for who I am, being understood for who I am. Just having a family, you know, a family that is more open to anything I want to do, anything from who I love to the person I would eventually marry, to have support, you know. It's difficult sometimes when you grow up in a household where they don't accept you. So being in the queer community, like I consider like one of my advisors, like my mom, like when I had relationship issues, they would sit down and they would tell me how it is. And they're like, you know, as a person in the community, here's how it is. And when I needed resources, when I needed scholarships and everything. In fact, I just applied to a scholarship, thankfully, because one of my advisors from my first year of college was like, girl, you're queer, I'm queer, here's money, apply. And so I just feel very supported by the queer community. Even by the way I dress sometimes, the way like I have shoes, and it's just like a really nice understanding. I have so many friends now in the queer community, and it's just like beautiful to have like a family supporting you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really beautiful, right? To have support and you know, shout out to your advisor for knowing how to get you those coins, because it is hard out here, and I always am so like just in awe of the way that you know members in the queer community when you have found, you know, your group, your family, how important like knowledge, sharing resources comes to play. And so do you think you have found your queer community or a queer community?
So I found a queer community. So I have friends who are queer. However, though, seeing queer Peruvians is not a thing I see. One of my cousins is bisexual, so that's the closest to her Peruvian in a community is. You know, growing up, all I saw was white queers, and that was it. Ellen DeGeneres was God. Ricky Martin was, you know, the male God version. And so I never really had somebody to look up to. I don't think I have found a lot of queer Hispanics yet, because again, there's a lot of stereotypes and everything in the Hispanic household. I have met some like Ecuadorians, some Mexicans, but never Peruvians. And it's something I even struggle to see. And sometimes I'm like, you know, it would be nice to see like a bisexual or a lesbian or even a trans woman or a trans man who's Peruvian, so we could talk about lomo sotado and like recipes and music and Renata Flores and Quechua and everything. And I haven't found that yet, and it's very saddening. You know, seeing everything, the riots were happening due to politics, and me seeing like a lot of LGBTQ and a lot of trans women in Peru, I'm like, I finally found them, you know, through videos and everything. And I feel like if it wasn't for me catching up with Instagram or even Facebook and seeing everything that's happening and, you know, the queer community in Peru holding it down for us, I wouldn't have met them. And even then, I have not met them because I haven't got to Peru. So here, you know, there's barely any Peruvians that I know who are queer. So I have found a community, predominantly Black and white, but not really much Peruvians. Yeah, I met like a couple of Hispanics who are queer, but never Peruvians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also find that, right, like I think that, you know, this is one of the reasons, you know, for my own doing of this project, right? Because I remember when I posted the flyer, I was like, oh, you know, I'm just gonna leave it and like we'll see, right? We'll see if people respond, because like I think, you know, you were getting to the fact that these online spaces have allowed you to see more queer Peruvians, right? Like whether that's in Peru, but, you know, like you, I haven't met in person, right? So I knew that I had some queer Peruvians on my Instagram, and I didn't anticipate, you know, actually hearing from so many people. And yeah, I hear you on that. Like, I think sometimes it's hard to find queer and trans Peruvians, like in our local communities. But definitely, you know, these online spaces have been important, right? Because like you, I was seeing queer and trans, you know, Black Indigenous Peruvians at the front of all of these protests, right, that were happening in November. And that was really powerful. So what does it mean for you to simultaneously identify as Peruvian and queer?
I feel like it's really important. I feel like it brings light, it brings our community together, regardless if we are LGBTQ, regardless if we're Peruvian. It brings more inclusion to our community. It brings more education to communities like ours. It brings a family, and it brings members together. It like educates people, and like it's been a beautiful thing. And like seeing more queer Peruvians and being able to speak to them, well, some, but you know, it's really important for me. because it's something I didn't even imagine seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you feel that your identities, you said that it's important to you. So do you feel that your identities coexist in the same spaces?
Yeah, big time for sure. I went into the Supreme Court to fight the Civil Rights Act of, I forgot the year. I want to say 19 something. I forgot the year. But, I was able to speak in Spanish, and which is never a thing I would ever imagine. Like, my Spanish isn't perfect. Like, yes, I could hold a conversation. Yes, I could curse you out in Spanish. But, talking in front of the Supreme Court when they were hearing all of these verdicts to give basic human rights to LGBTQ when it comes to the workforce was really important. I was able to speak Spanish. I was able to have white, Black, Indigenous, Filipinos, Asians, Muslims, every community to know that we exist, that I am Peruvian, I'm also Cuban, but we exist, and I'm able to communicate. Like, a lot of people were like, oh, I didn't know Peruvians were gay. And I was like, hello, like, I'm here. So it brought awareness. And it's always something that's really important to me because, again, it's not something you see every day. You see predominantly white and Black LGBTQ individuals, and you never really see Peruvian. So for me, I carry it around. Like, every time when somebody asked me what country I'm from, I was like, I'm Peruvian. And they're like, oh, that's nice. And I was like, I'm also LGBTQ. And they're like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah. I was like, they're really important to me. And so, every time like I advocate for LGBTQ rights, I advocate for Hispanic communities, but predominantly Peruvians, because again, it's not something you see in a common space.
Mm-hmm. That's so powerful. Thank you for the work that you're doing and that you've done in going to the Supreme Court. Like, that's really powerful. And I think that also just in talking, you said that even when you talk to people, you bring up both of your identities, right? And that's powerful as well, right? So, like, speaking in front of the Supreme Court, powerful in its own way. And I also think that there's something really important that you're touching on, in that, when you self-disclose these identities that feel important to you, that's also important, right? It allows you to be visible in that sense. And so, you were also saying that people ask you, right? They're like, oh, or they say, oh, I didn't know that, there were queer Peruvians, right? Like, and so in general, I'm curious, how do you feel Peruvians perceive queer folks?
So being in Peru for 2 weeks, it was heartbreaking because religion holds a really important virtue within my family. So it hurt because, again, I couldn't be myself, with my aunt. And so going to Peru and not being able to see queer folks was difficult. In America, sometimes even working in Starbucks, sometimes like people come in and they have an LGBT shirt. I was like, oh my God, you are, me too. And I couldn't do that in Peru. And so it was very difficult. And I could only imagine people who actually live there, For me, it was only 2 weeks hiding who I am, hiding my tattoos and everything. But people who live there, I could only imagine how difficult it is. And in fact, there was somebody from Venezuela who was a trans woman there. And I spoke to her and she migrated to Peru because unfortunately, circumstances in Venezuela are really bad and they had to come to Peru. And so it was the only queer person I've met there. And I would talk to her and I was like, oh my God. I was like, you're queer? I was like, me too. And we would have a conversation, and she would be like, yeah, not many people like us here. And I was like, well, why? And she would tell me, she's like, well, I'm from Venezuela. That's one thing, but also because I'm a trans woman. And I'm like, why? And she's like, religion plays a big role here. So sometimes I have to act more feminine so they won't out me. And another thing, it was, I was hearing a podcast, El Hilo, which talked about trans women, a Peruvian, trans woman going to Peru to, I believe, Argentina or Uruguay, and they're doing it by sexes. So trans women have been having more of a harder time to get going to supermarkets and everything because they're basing it in gender. Thankfully in Peru, it's not a case, but there's so much discrimination for LGBTQ because it's not under God's way. It's always a male and a female. So it was very difficult to actually like go to Peru and find out everything that's happening to the queer community. But it was also very satisfying to see in the protest. They were the first ones there. You know, you saw like an LGBT flag, and I was like, oh my God, they exist. And it just hurt me because when I got there, I didn't have the chance to see people who are like me, and I wasn't able to communicate with them. In fact, I didn't even know they existed, except for that trans woman who wasn't even Peruvian. She was from Venezuela.
Yeah, and it is so hurtful, right? To know that, you know, in Peru, and I think that we can speak, you know, like even in the US, I think that the ways that we see it is different. And I think that it is hurtful to know that, you know, there's harm happening, that there's discrimination happening and violence, you know, physical violence enacted on people's bodies. And as you said, right, even in that, queer and trans, you know, Black, Indigenous Peruvians were the first ones, you know, in the protest. They were in the front of the line, right? Every single day I was seeing, you know, them putting their bodies on the line, right, for Peru, for our country. And so, you know, you named feeling hurt, and you named, you know, the discrimination that you saw and that you know of. And so my question is, you know, how do we, as queer Peruvians, knowing that there is harm and that there is violence enacted, you know, against us, against our bodies, you know, how do we move, you know, how do we survive this? You know, how do we survive that?
Well, for one, it's not going to be easy. I feel like we have to put ourselves out, and we have to educate people that we exist, to start with. And second of all, you know, we have to educate people in Peru. We have to support the queer folks and that are there. We have to elect people who are like us in position of power. We have to basically start having classes. You know, it's gonna be difficult. Again, it's not something you see, but just like, you know, having a divorce in Peru was never a thing, and now people have the ability to have a divorce. It's creating safe places in Peru, having communication with those who are in Peru, and having them, you know, explain to their own families, hey, this is what is happening to this community, and I feel like you should care about them. And, you know, it's not going to be easy. Again, you know, religion plays a huge role in Peru. But to create this notion, to create progress in Peru, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard. But if we're not pushing through being uncomfortable, should it even matter? And so I feel like we need to educate people. Even in the United States, some people don't even know what trans is. People don't even know what gender non-binary is. People don't know what queer is, you know. People don't know what the Stone riots were, you know. People are not educated, and sometimes we have to educate people and make people uncomfortable. And if we don't make people uncomfortable, how are they gonna learn? And so I feel it's the same thing in Peru. You know, it's more difficult in Peru because it's not in the United States. You know, we don't have same-sex marriage in Peru. Ecuador has it, but it's not the same thing as Peru. You know, you might cross the border, get married, and then come back to Peru. But even then, there's more of a chance of you being killed in Peru because same-sex marriage is not a thing. It's hard for somebody to even be out and who they are, holding hands, because God forbid you get killed. So I feel like educating people, you know, putting it in your social media, putting a flag, your Peruvian flag in social media for people to see you in Instagram or even Facebook or any of your social platforms to be like, wow, there's queer folks in the United States who are Peruvian, or people who live in Peru. It's like, wow, there are queer folks who live in Peru, and locating them. You know, I found one, and I feel like he was in Lima, like the capital of Lima, and he's like, oh, I'm a queer folk. I was like, oh my God, hi, like I'm from Panamonga, but I live in the United States. And he's like, yeah, it's difficult. I educate a lot of people on gayness and what is to be gay and everything. So is it gonna be easy? Of course not. You know, nothing comes easy. Change doesn't come easy. But I feel like we need to start being ourselves, our authentic selves, but we also need to educate the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm grateful for all of these ways that, you know, that you've named that we can do this work, right? And I think change definitely is not easy, right? It's and even thinking about, you know, larger works of you know, restructuring systems, dismantling systems, that doesn't happen overnight, you know. And I think that like you said, you know, that these aspects of educating folks, of meeting other queer Peruvians, right, are so necessary. And I'm a big believer in that, naming these things. So, you know, like all of the things that you've named, right, I'm a big believer in naming them. You know, it starts to generate, you know, really powerful potential, right? This like really radical potential that we're going to be able to see this happen and work to make this happen. And so thank you so much for sharing. And so, you know, we're talking about your queerness, we're talking about your Peruvianness. I wonder if there are any other identities that are salient to you.
Well, I am half Cuban, so my Cuban identity, even though I've never been to Cuba, I barely talk to my family in Cuba. I do have aunts that I talk to who live in Florida and Miami. So Cuban is also important to me, not as much as Peruvian. Being Peruvian means to me, being, you know, a first generation student is really important to me as well. You know, it's difficult. My parents never went to college, and now I'm getting my master's. So it's, you know, that speaks volumes to me. And it also, again, educates fellow Latinos that they could possibly do the same thing that I'm doing as well. So, you know, aside from Cuban and the first generation, also, you know, I'm coming to terms with being, you know, indigenous. My aunt speaks Quechua, so I'm trying to learn Quechua and learning more about my culture and learning more about the language. That speaks a lot to me, because again, it's not something I ever imagined me being. I only thought I was Peruvian, and when I went to my aunt's house and she started speaking Quechua, I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, you didn't know? Like, I live in the indigenous lands in Peru. And I'm like, oh, so you speak Quechua. So, you know, aside from those identities, really much being Peruvian, being first generation student, being indigenous, coming into terms with it, but also being Cuban, those are really important to me. And, you know, besides being queer, those identities really hold power to me because it's who I am.
Yeah. So how do the identities that you shared, right? And you can talk about any of them, you can talk about all of them, but how do these identities that you just shared interact with your queerness and your Peruvianness, right? You said they all make up who you are. So how do you see them interacting together?
So being Hispanic, being half Cuban and half Peruvian, you know, some people come to this country not knowing they're able to go to college. Some of them are not even able to understand who they are within their sexuality or gender expression. You know, some of them don't even like think of coming to America for a better possibility. So, you know, being able to be who I am and being who, you know, who I like, where I go to school, or where religion my parents are, or anything, I feel like my identity has a lot to do with my queerness. It has a lot to do with the generations following, you know, them being able to see somebody who is basically like them could help communities and could help people, you know. Sometimes, like, if it wasn't for Ricky Martin, like, as cliche as this sounds, you know, I wouldn't know there were Hispanic gays because everybody was so closeted, you know. Again, all I saw was Ellen DeGeneres, and I thought she was Jesus for me. And so coming into my identities plays a big role. And I feel like if I can't be who I am, then nobody's going to understand who the future generation will be. And future generations right now are being so open with themselves and discovering who themselves. And even then, I keep seeing in TikToks like videos like, I can't be myself because my parents aren't loving and supporting. And I was like, listen, you know, as a fellow Hispanic LGBTQ individual, you know, I am your family now. And here you have a person that you could talk to, you have a person you could call, have a person you could cry to. And the same thing that goes with education, you know, it's hard being a Hispanic going to school, let alone a first generation. You have so much pressure on you to being the perfect student. And parents are like, yeah, you could do it, but they don't understand the value and the stress you go through to go to school and get a degree. Not along that, they don't understand how America works sometimes, because being a first generation student, they think everything's going to be handed to you. Once you graduate, oh, you must have a job. And it's not like that. And so having my identities, teaching people how life really is in the other side could actually influence them and create a safe space for everyone.
Mm-hmm. That, you know, all of what you shared, I think speaks to what a process it is, right? To come to terms with each identity individually, right? So I imagine that in your Peruanidad, in being Cuban, queer, you know, first gen, all of, you know, and coming to terms with indigeneity, like each of these involve a different process, right? And And so I imagine that when you put them all together, that's also going to look very differently, right? As you were saying, and as you were speaking, it sounds like each of them are impacting the other. And also, you were saying that I love what you shared about, if there's someone that you see someone that says they're not able to be, their authentic self, and you said, well, I'll be your family now, right? And that is so powerful, and really beautiful that you take that on, and that you have that approach, because I think it is very difficult to navigate each of these identities. And I think in this navigating, right, to share with you, I do healing work that centers, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I've been trained in Black feminist methods. I've been trained in the tenets of healing justice. Like, that's where a lot of my background work is. And so for me, as you're talking about all of these identities, all of these processes, everything that you've experienced, I get really curious as to how folks center wellness and how they view or how they are healing. And so the next few questions are going to touch a little bit more on those aspects. And so what does wellness look like for you?
Wellness is actually taking care both physically and mentally. Going to therapy, going to the gym, taking care of myself. Everybody thinks wellness automatically leads to health. And although health is a beautiful thing, if you're healthy, you're more able to do stuff, you're able-bodied. But that doesn't mean that disabled people can be healthy at all. But wellness for me is basically being both physically and mentally healthy. Going to therapy is I'm a big believer. I mean, I'm going to school to be a therapist. Even being Hispanic and going to therapy is also another stigma that people face. And so being healthy, having wellness is basically coming to terms both mentally and physically for me.
Yeah, naming the multiple aspects of wellness, right? And so what about healing?
Well, I feel like everybody has trauma. Some people have more trauma than others. And being a first generation, I'm not a first generation Peruvian, first generation Hispanic. It's really hard because we not only have to identify us with our culture, but we also have to identify with the American culture and to be this perfect person, because automatically people think that, we came illegally when that's not the case. And I have to be the perfect student. I have to be the limelight for everyone. And for me, it's healing this trauma, healing these stigmas, healing the expectations of not being the perfect person. I feel like we put so much pressure on ourselves to be the perfect person, when in reality, once we heal, we don't care. We become our authentic self. And so I'm currently in the process of healing. Like I mentioned before, I'm going to therapy. I'm learning more about myself, but also, the trauma that I went through, not having the perfect relationship with my biological father and coming into terms with my identities. And so healing hasn't been easy, but it's a beautiful process to be healed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you named, that healing is a process, and it makes me glad to hear that you're finding that therapy, is helping you do that. I was originally trained in, you know, like healing justice aspects, yes, but it was coming from like a liberation psychology background. And so I also think that, you know, having access to therapy is a really important thing. And I think that, you know, we can argue that there needs to be better access in communities. And you said you're going to school to be a therapist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what year are you currently?
So I'm currently in my first year. My program is a 2-year program in Hunter College. And so when I graduate, I get my MD. And then from there, I would have to take my state exam. And then from there, I need 3,000 hours of experience. So it's a journey. It's a journey of self-discovering myself and loving who I am, but also in order to help people, I have to also heal my traumas and learn who I am in order to help people.
Well, I wish you nothing but the best and all the positive vibes your way as you go through, you know, your program and also your own healing journey, right? Because as you said, you know, we're each going through it, right? We're each trying to heal our own trauma. And so all the positive vibes your way. And I'm also curious what community looks like for you.
Community means acceptance, love, open arms. Like every time I think of like community, I always have like somebody in the back of my head like, yes, girl, you do it. And so that community basically means family for me, having like a support system to always have my back when I fall or when I'm having a bad day. So it's always that one person or a couple of people always like, girl, you got this. Let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah, so support, right? Support, the encouragement, the affirmations. So who makes up the community you're part of? You don't have to name names, but like just
no. Predominantly a lot of the LGBTQ individuals because that's who I feel more comfortable with. You know, some of my family members, my stepfather, like he is my best friend. I call him for everything. And who else could I think of? Like some college friends, some grad school friends. So it's always like at least one person that hits me up in the morning, like, how are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm good, you know, just doing homework. And so it's just like family, a lot of the LGBTQ folks, because they're super supporting, super loving. And a couple of friends in grad school and my undergrad and even high school who still support me.
How has having, you know, this community, you named a bunch of different folks who seem to have different roles, you know, so how has having a community impacted you?
A lot. It impacted me to be who I am without like hiding who I am. You know, it helped me going to school. You know, I got denied out of a graduate school. So reapplying was hard for me, and having this support system to have my back, I was able to get to a grad school who accepted me. Not only that, but also like having somebody to care for me is one thing. You know, I'm very blessed to have people that care for me and help me when I in need of anything. And so having a community has affected me in many ways, you know, supporting me from like leaving my IAP to going to AP classes, which it never has anybody in the child care study team in my high school has ever done. You know, one of my professors, I see him as like a third father, and he was the first one to be like, you're super smart. Do not let your disabilities get the best of you. We're going to take you out of these classes and put you in AP classes. So it's learning more about myself, learning that I have potential, being who I am, and, you know, not being afraid to reach out to somebody in my community when I need somebody.
That's so important, right? To know that you have these people that you can turn to, and it sounds like you do. It sounds like you have, you know, people that are there that are supporting you, and you mentioned, you know, like applying for grad school. Oh, that's such a process. That is so much labor, not just in the applications, but like what you go through emotionally.
And money.
Oh, the money. and then when you're in academia too, right? Like that's another, when you're actually in the program, that's another story. And so yeah, I'm glad to hear that you have people that you can turn to, right? That are there and are supporting you. What about pleasure? Does that come up for you when you think of your intersecting Peruvian and queer identities, or how you move through life?
You know, pleasure is like for me, I played tennis throughout my whole life, and so you know, pleasure for me, it's like listening to music. And now I've been listening to Renata Flores, who sings in Quechua. So it's learning more about my Peruvian side, but also like learning more about myself. Every time I'm in the tennis court, I meet somebody new, and sometimes they're Hispanic. And I was like, oh my God, what country are you from? And I'm like, I'm the first one to be like, I'm Peruvian and my mom's Cuban. And they're like, oh, really? And then, you know, pleasure for me is also reading books and educating myself on topics that I have no idea. And so, you know, everybody has their own pleasure. You know, some people go to clubs and go to parties, and my pleasure is more about, you know, learning more about myself and learning about my intersectionalities, but also like loving myself.
Mm-hmm. I love hearing, you know, that at the root, it sounds like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like, you know, at the root of all of the things you've named is still, you know, this love that you have for yourself, right? So you're listening to Renata Flores, you are playing tennis, right? And it comes down to, you know, you're doing these things that are pleasurable because you love yourself, right? And you're able to it sounds like you're able to prioritize those different aspects that bring you pleasure. And so I have two more questions. But one of them is, what do you wish for yourself?
That's a hard one. So one of the things I really, really wish for myself is to graduate with my master's, because, you know, I'm not working so many shifts in Starbucks, dragging myself for late night studies for an overnighter and doing homework for nothing. I want my master's, but I also like, in the future, one of my biggest goals is to open an LGBTQ shelter for individuals who have been kicked out, preferably people of color, indigenous folks, for them to have a safe place. So that is one of my biggest dreams and wishes, and I'm striving, and I'm hopefully going to make it happen. So that is one of my biggest wishes, but also like I wish more acceptance and more love, both being, you know, LGBTQ in Peru, but also like for America too. There are so many states that still have conversion therapy. There's so many now with a lot of Republican governors are trying to take away trans children from sports. And so I wish for myself to educate people, for there to be more acceptance and more love and more visibility amongst my intersectionalities.
Yeah, and I hear you wanting to, you're putting in the work, you are working so hard to get your master's, and you have this, this goal of yours to open up this shelter for LGBT folks. And so I'm manifesting, that you graduate, you got this, and that, the shelter becomes a reality. So know that, there's someone out there manifesting, your success. And so what about for queer Peruvians? What do you wish for them?
For one, visibility. Like, I want to see more of us in the world. I want, us to communicate with each other. I want acceptance in Peru. I want same-sex marriage to be a thing. I want trans women to be people in places with power, I want for them to be loved for who they are. And, I want people to acknowledge them for who they are, but also educate themselves and they're uncomfortable with the community to learn about that and have a safer place. I wish Peru was a safer place for queer folks, it's even difficult for being indigenous themselves, how much hard it is, mainly if you basically only speak Quechua, people see you as, like a grain of rice and a whole bag of rice. So I want people to love queer folks. I want people to acknowledge that they exist, but also make policies and change the government to allow them to exist. And basically always have an opening hand for them and supporting them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I'm holding everything that you've just shared, and I share in wanting, wanting to see more of us and to connect, and to actually see tangible legislation, right, policies, to see us in power and positions of power, and I, in going back to your piece on visibility and connection, I am so grateful that you reached out, that you chose to connect with me. And I'm so grateful for everything that you've shared with me today. I do not take it lightly. I really am so grateful to be able to have met you, to have heard your story. And so before, we wrap officially, is there anything else you wish to share with me?
One thing is we exist, Peruvian queer folks is we do exist, we do matter, and that people need to learn and educate themselves about our community within being LGBTQ, but also being Peruvian and queer.
Absolutely. I agree with you. And we do exist, right? Like, here we are, here at least you and I are.
Yeah.
Like, how can you say we don't exist? Like, we're here. Thank you so much, Mel, for everything again. And I'm going to stop the recording officially. There's nothing else that you would like to share?
No.
Stop the recording.